Sometimes, the deepest loyalty is found not in people, but in a pair of eyes that wait endlessly, hoping someone will come back. In a forgotten corner of a small town in Ohio, where weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalks and old mailboxes rusted quietly under gray skies, there stood a house that had long since been abandoned. Its paint had peeled away in layers, its windows shattered by time and storms, and the front door sagged crookedly on its hinges. But what made this house stand out wasn't the decay, it was the figure that sat, day after day, on the crumbling front porch. It was a dog. A skinny, brown dog with fur thinned by hunger and weather, his body curled tightly on the cold concrete like he was trying to disappear into it. He had no collar. No food bowl. No name tag. But he had a routine. Every morning, before the sun rose fully above the rooftops, he would sit up straight, ears perked, and stare at the front door of the house. Every passing car, every shuffle of leaves, every gust of wind stirred something in him, hope. But nothing ever came. Neighbors began to notice. Some thought he was guarding something. Others said he was abandoned. A few kind souls tried to help, leaving out bowls of water, scraps of food, even soft blankets. But the dog, though never aggressive, refused to leave the porch. He would sniff at the food cautiously, eat only when the humans walked away, and then return to his place beside the door, watching. Waiting. Children began calling him the porch dog. Older folks shook their heads and said, "That dog's waiting for someone who's never coming back." Stories started to swirl, that the family who lived there had fallen on hard times and moved out in the night, that they couldn't afford to take the dog, or worse, simply didn't want to. But the dog, he didn't know abandonment. All he knew was love. And in his loyal heart, love meant staying. Love meant waiting. Even if the door never opened again. Winter began to creep in. Frost painted the edges of windows, and the nights grew long and bitter. Still, the dog remained. His body shook from the cold. His breath puffed out in quiet clouds. Yet he kept his eyes on the door like it might swing open any second, revealing a familiar face, a warm voice, the home he once knew. His loyalty became a quiet protest against the cruelty of his past. A silent testament that love, once given, doesn't vanish, it waits. Word of the dog spread online when a local posted his photo. In the picture, the dog sat with his head tilted, his eyes hollow yet hopeful, the wind tugging gently at his ears. The caption read, "He's been waiting for weeks. Someone please help him." That post reached a young man named Jimmy, a volunteer at the nearby animal rescue. He had seen abandoned dogs before, but something about this one tugged hard at his chest. It wasn't just the photo, it was the eyes. Those eyes didn't just show sadness. They showed devotion. And devotion like that should never be left out in the cold. Jimmy wasn't a stranger to rescue missions. He had been volunteering at the shelter for over 2 years, and he'd seen animals in terrible conditions, dogs tied to fences, cats thrown from moving cars, puppies abandoned in cardboard boxes. But something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the stillness in the photo, the unwavering focus in the dog's eyes. Or maybe it was something inside Jimmy himself that felt just as lonely. Whatever it was, he grabbed his rescue kit, filled a small thermos with chicken broth, and drove to the address on the post. When Jimmy arrived, the wind was biting cold. Dry leaves rustled across the cracked sidewalk, and the house stood just as broken as he expected. But there he was, the dog from the photo, curled on the same spot by the door, his body trembling against the chill. He didn't bark or run. He just lifted his head slightly and stared at Jimmy with tired, guarded eyes. Jimmy crouched several feet away and didn't say a word. He didn't want to scare him. Instead, he unscrewed the thermos and let the scent of warm broth drift through the air. The dog's nose twitched. That was a good sign. "I'm not here to take you away," Jimmy whispered softly. "I'm just here to sit with you." The first visit lasted almost 2 hours. The dog didn't come closer, but he didn't leave either. He sniffed the air, occasionally looked away, but mostly kept his gaze locked on Jimmy's every move. Before leaving, Jimmy placed a thick fleece blanket near the porch, gently rolled up so it wouldn't blow away. The dog didn't touch it. But Jimmy came back the next day. And the next. Every day, he brought food, boiled chicken, soft bread, the occasional slice of turkey, and sat on the same spot on the sidewalk. He didn't try to lure the dog or trap him. He just existed beside him. That's what trust needed sometimes, time and presence. By the fourth day, the dog had begun inching closer to the edge of the porch when Jimmy arrived. On the fifth, he accepted a piece of chicken from Jimmy's hand, then immediately retreated to his usual spot. It wasn't much. But it was everything. Neighbors began to take notice. One elderly woman, wrapped in a heavy scarf, came out one afternoon and said, "You're the only one he's ever let near him." Jimmy nodded, not taking his eyes off the dog. On the seventh day, a light snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting lazily onto the sidewalk. Jimmy came again, this time with something new, an old sweatshirt that smelled like him. He placed it on the porch gently, not far from the dog's paws. "That's for you," he said with a small smile. The dog sniffed it, then slowly laid down on top of it. It was the first time Jimmy saw him relax, even just a little. No more growling. No flinching. Just a quiet surrender. That was the moment Jimmy knew it was time. He opened the back of his car, carefully setting up a thick blanket, a small bowl of food, and a crate with the door open. He didn't force him. Instead, Jimmy sat near the crate and spoke to him softly, like he would to a scared child. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not taking you away from your home. I'm just giving you a new one." After nearly 30 minutes of stillness, the dog stood up. He hesitated. Took one step, then another. Slowly, cautiously, he walked toward Jimmy and gently placed his head on his lap. Jimmy froze. His eyes welled up with tears. He stroked the dog's thin back and whispered, "You're safe now, buddy." He picked him up carefully, wrapped in the sweatshirt, and carried him to the car. The dog didn't resist. For the first time in months, he wasn't waiting. He was leaving, not behind something lost, but towards something new. The shelter was warm, but not loud. That was on purpose. The staff knew trauma didn't leave dogs with just scars on their bodies, it left marks on their souls. Max, as Jimmy had quietly begun calling him, was given a quiet corner kennel with thick blankets, dim lighting, and a little radio that played soft classical music all night. It wasn't much. But to a dog who had spent months sleeping on concrete, it felt like a palace. Still, Max didn't seem to notice the comfort. He curled into himself and kept his eyes on the door. Every creak of the shelter's hinges made him look up with a mix of hope and fear, then look away again when no one came for him. He ate very little and barely barked. When volunteers approached, he sometimes shook. He wasn't aggressive, he was just tired. Like his spirit had been waiting so long, it didn't know how to do anything else. Jimmy didn't push him. Every day after his shift, he would sit outside Max's kennel, back against the wall, a book in his hands. He read out loud, sometimes silly adventure books, sometimes calm nature stories. He talked about his day, even if Max didn't respond. It became a quiet ritual. At first, Max only watched. Then, slowly, he started to inch closer to the bars of the kennel. One day, Jimmy reached his fingers through the gap, and Max leaned in. It was the first true contact they'd had since the porch. The shelter staff took notice. Max didn't trust anyone else the way he trusted Jimmy. So they gave Jimmy more time, even letting him take Max into the small, quiet room, where traumatized dogs were allowed to decompress without the noise of barking and cleaning. In that room, Jimmy would sit with him on the floor, brushing his fur gently. Max would lean against his leg, sometimes trembling in his sleep. That's when the full story came out. The family that used to live in the house had skipped town in the middle of the night. Financial troubles. Unpaid rent. They had taken what little they could carry, and left Max behind. There was no rescue attempt. No return. No goodbye. The landlord said they hadn't even mentioned the dog. He was just left. Jimmy listened in silence when he heard this. It made something inside him ache. He, too, had been left before. By a parent who disappeared when he was 9. By friends who didn't understand why he kept people at arm's length. Maybe that's why Max's eyes looked so familiar. They were mirrors. They were both survivors of silent goodbyes. Weeks passed, and Max began to change. It was slow, like watching winter melt into spring. The first time he wagged his tail when Jimmy entered the room, it was barely a flick. But Jimmy saw it. The first time Max nudged Jimmy's arm for more scratches, it was so soft Jimmy thought he imagined it. But it was real. Max started eating more. Sleeping deeper. He even barked one morning, a startled, awkward sound, like he was trying to remember how his voice worked. The staff clapped. Jimmy laughed. And Max, for the first time, looked proud. The shelter began introducing him to potential adopters. A retired woman. A young couple. A family with 2 kids. But Max remained cautious. He wouldn't approach strangers. When they offered treats, he backed away. When they spoke kindly, he only looked at Jimmy. The others didn't take it personally. They understood. Max had already chosen his person. One Saturday afternoon, the shelter director sat beside Jimmy in the hallway as Max rested with his head on Jimmy's lap. She looked at him quietly for a moment, then asked, "Why haven't you adopted him yet?" Jimmy chuckled. "My place is tiny. I work 2 jobs. I don't even have a backyard." "But you have something he needs more than a backyard," she said softly. "You have trust." That night, Jimmy lay awake, thinking. He had always believed he wasn't ready for a dog. That dogs needed big spaces and flexible time. But Max didn't want space, he wanted safety. He didn't need freedom, he needed belonging. And Jimmy, though he had little, had that to give. The next morning, he filled out the adoption papers. No hesitation. No second thoughts. When Max walked out of the shelter that day, he wasn't in a crate. He wasn't being dragged by a leash. He trotted beside Jimmy, ears perked, tail raised, not all the way, but enough to show a spark had returned. They drove home with the windows cracked. Max poked his head out, sniffing the world. And Jimmy kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting gently on Max's back. They were no longer alone. Life with Max was nothing like Jimmy had expected. It was better. Max learned to climb stairs, to curl up on the couch, to wait patiently by the fridge for cheese snacks. He followed Jimmy from room to room, like a shadow stitched to his side. On weekends, they went for walks along the river, where Max sniffed the wind and watched birds in the trees. At night, Max would curl into a donut on Jimmy's bed, breathing deeply for the first time in years. They became each other's routine. Each other's calm. But even peace has limits. It started subtly. Max began panting more during walks. Sometimes he refused to climb stairs. Then, one cold December night, he collapsed while chasing a falling leaf. Jimmy rushed him to the emergency vet. The news came quietly, gently. "His heart has been under too much stress for too long," the vet explained. "Starvation, cold, trauma, it's all taken a toll. His body fought hard, but he may not have much time." Jimmy nodded, but his face didn't show shock. Deep down, he had always known Max's wounds weren't just emotional. He had always known their time might be short. That night, they lay together on the living room floor, wrapped in blankets, with soft jazz playing on the radio. Jimmy whispered stories of the day he found him. Of how strong he had been. Of how he had changed Jimmy's life. Max rested his head on Jimmy's chest, listening. Breathing. Trusting. Just before sunrise, Max opened his eyes one last time. He looked up at Jimmy with the same gaze he had on that porch months ago. But this time, there was no fear. No waiting. Just peace. And then, quietly, he was gone. Jimmy didn't cry right away. He just held him, like he had that first night, and whispered, "You didn't die alone, Max. You died loved." Later, Jimmy wrote on social media, "I didn't rescue Max. He rescued me. And I would go through every heartbreak again just to give him a home where he never had to wait alone again." Some animals wait their whole lives for someone who will never return. But all it takes is one person to rewrite the ending of their story. Love doesn't erase pain, but it gives it purpose. If Max waited for months just for love to return, how long will we wait before giving that love to the one still out there, hoping, watching, and waiting?